Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. And I hope you've been having a good week. It's ended up well. And I ask you to go ahead this morning and go through the routine, if you will, like and share the post. And then grab a Bible, and we will be in the 105th Psalm today, continuing to look at this Psalm. And again, a marvelous Psalm for even us today. It was a Psalm that was specifically written to encourage the Israelites as they returned from their Babylonian captivity and found their city of Jerusalem in ruins. And the psalmist writes just to remind them that God had been faithful in the past, and so that they should continue to trust Him even in that situation. And so there is again a parallel lesson for you and I. We may not find ourselves with our city destroyed, but we do oftentimes find ourselves in times of discouragement and wondering what we're going to do next and how we're going to survive. And this psalm is a good place to turn for strength. So picking up in verse 16, and you're going to notice, like the previous psalm, this psalm goes back and relies very heavily on the book of Genesis. The previous few verses went back to the covenant that God made with Abraham. And now we're going to continue to follow straight really through the book of Genesis and come to the story of Joseph. Great story of Joseph, one that is probably one of the first Bible stories that many of us learned, was the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors. And so the psalmist is going to use the story of Joseph to remind the people of how God works things out and cares for His people, even in dark situations. Again, Joseph being sold into slavery, and the whole story of him ending up in prison because of the accusations of Potiphar's wife, and then the famine that came in the land. But when the famine came, Joseph had been made second in charge in Egypt. He was in charge of the food, and so he was able to take care of his family. And so God raised Joseph up for that time. And so the psalmist is using that to remind his readers, to remind us that God is as the song goes, God is an on-time God, that He does see His people, He cares for His people, and that He put Joseph there in that time for the situation, and that He will continue to take care of His people. Now, let's go ahead and let's start looking at the text. It says in verse 16, it says, "Moreover, He called for a famine upon the land. He brake the whole staff of bread." Now, what this refers to again is the famine that came onto the land, and the famine came because of their sin, because of the sin that was in the land. And so this famine was a 7-year long famine, and God had warned Pharaoh through the dream that this was going to happen. When that happened, look what it says in verse 17. Here's the part that's important for us. He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron, until the time that his word came. The word of the Lord tried him. The king sent and loosed him, even the ruler of the people, and let him go free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his substance, to bind his princes at his pleasure and teach his senators wisdom. Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. And so what we have here is the psalmist reminding you and I, reminding his original audience that that even go back to the time when Joseph's brothers were selling him into slavery, and they thought that they were getting rid of this annoying little brother, and thought they were doing things the way they would have them done. But even in that, God was working through that as a way, as a means to ultimately deliver his people. God was was getting Joseph to Egypt and getting him in the right position to help the people, to help his people. Now we know it wasn't a good way to get there. But we see here again that he was imprisoned, that he was put in chains, he was sold as a slave by his brother in the 37th chapter of Genesis. But through it all, God was at work, and that was the lesson that the Israelites needed to hear at this exact moment as they looked around at the remnants. They themselves were a remnant, and their city was a remnant. It was in rubble, and as they looked around at that, they needed to understand and be reminded that even in the worst of situations, that God is still on the throne. They needed to learn that New Testament principle that you and I know, again, that we've talked about already in this psalm, that all things work together for good to those that love him and are called according to his purpose. Again, it doesn't say everything is good, but that God is working those things out. And we know the story of Joseph. I'm not going through the whole thing. Sold into slavery. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, and Joseph resists, so she accuses him of assaulting her. He ends up being thrown in jail. He interprets some prisoners' dreams. They promise to remember him, but they don't, so he stays in jail. He ultimately is brought before Pharaoh, interprets Pharaoh's dreams for him. And so God, we see some very dark hours in Joseph's life, and yet we see how God wove that all together for good, and the Israelites in this situation needed to hear that, and it may be exactly what you need to hear today as you're going through your circumstances, that even in the darkest of hours, that God can still bring that together. He can use that in a way that he gets glory and that you benefit from. And so through all of this, again, God ends up putting Joseph in second in command in Egypt, in charge of all the food. And because of that, because of Joseph's position, both the nation of Egypt and the people of Israel were able to survive this famine. And so he goes on and says, in verse 23, he says there, Israel also came to Egypt, we read that a while ago, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham, and he increased his people greatly, and he made them stronger than their enemies. He turned their heart to hate his people, to deal subtly with his servants. And so you notice that he says, through all this dark, these desperate times that Joseph and the people of Israel go through, he reminds us that as that was happening, that Israel comes into the land, and they became stronger than their enemies. And so this little band of 70 that came with Jacob, that's the number, 70 people in Jacob's family, We'll go back and add up the numbers in the book of Genesis. Grew to the point where Pharaoh was afraid of them, where they were stronger even than their captives, and that we know ultimately. Then Pharaoh turned against the Israelites and treated them as slaves, and ultimately would end up killing many of them, killing their children. But the story. And the Israelites knew how that whole story turned out. That was one of those stories that was passed down, from great-great-grandpa. I mean, it had been retold over and over about the Egyptian bondage and God delivering them and bringing them to the promised land. And so this story would have been especially heartfelt to the Jews in this time, that God takes care of his people, that even before the famine, even before everything else, God had already began to bring the pieces together to take care of his people. Even before the first day of the famine, God was already on the job taking care of his people. And it's easy to look back now and see that. It's easy for us to look back and see through Joseph being sold into slavery, through the episode with Potiphar's wife, through what happens in the prison. It's easy now to look back and say, oh yeah, I see how God was at work and how he brought all of these things to be. But the psalmist is reminding them here that same God is still on the throne, still taking care of his people. And my task this morning is to remind you the same thing, that same God is still on the throne, that he still cares for his people, he still brings things together for good, even bad things. He brings them together for the good of his people. We just have to continue to follow him and to put our trust in him. And so let me encourage you today. I started out by saying I hope you've had a good week, and I hope you have. But if you haven't, or maybe you have a bad one next week, I want you to remember this story and remember how God brought all of these terrible things together to save his people, ultimately for their good. And so whatever it is that we're going through, we need to remember the same thing that the psalmist is teaching here today, that a good God still sits on the throne and cares for his people. Hope that helps you today. Hope that encourages you, and hope you have a good day and a good weekend. All right, we'll see you back here tomorrow morning.